3 months after Outpost Pharaoh, I learned something about the Voss that nobody had bothered to mention during my first tour with the Ashguard. Loyalty to an outsider isn't just a personal choice out here. It's a political liability. And politics, on a world built entirely around matriarchal war clans, gets settled the same way everything else does in front of witnesses, with weapons drawn and absolutely no room to back down. My name is still Corporal Mason Edo, though by the time this part of the story is over, that rank won't mean quite what it used to. Last time, I told you how a stolen batch of plasma cores turned into a court-martial with my name stapled to the wrong signature, and how that mistake landed me inside the Voss Ashguard, an all-female war sisterhood that doesn't do second chances, doesn't do subtlety, and very much doesn't do outsiders. I earned my place there. I dragged Commander Van out of a collapsing courtyard during a raider assault, turned a depot's backup generator into an improvised weapon, and when the tribunal cleared my name and handed me a shuttle ticket home, I gave the ticket back. I thought that was the hard part. I was wrong, because it turns out that keeping a human in an elite Voss war sisterhood doesn't just annoy Coalition High Command. It offends an entire alien culture built on bloodline clan pride, and about 4,000 years of tradition that says outsiders don't belong inside the Ashguard full stop. And when word of what happened at Outpost Pharaoh reached the Voss homeworld, it didn't take long for someone with real authority to come looking for answers. Her name was Matriarch Sella Van Cor, and she came to Pharaoh with an entire honor guard, a writ of formal grievance, and exactly one goal: strip me out of the Ashguard publicly, permanently, and make an example out of Commander Van for allowing it to happen in the first place. This is the story of how that visit nearly tore the unit apart, how an old enemy used the chaos to strike at the worst possible moment, and how I finally understood what General Hayes meant, all those years ago, about somebody having to become the thing holding the line together. Stick around. This one gets political before it gets bloody, and by the end it's both at once. The honor guard arrives. Life at Outpost Pharaoh had, against every reasonable expectation, settled into something that almost resembled routine. My bunk stayed in its spot near the center of the barracks. Sergeant Rask no longer called me the human, except when she wanted to needle me in front of new recruits. Ithara had gotten good enough at the footwork I'd taught her that she was teaching it to 2 other junior warriors, always careful to credit me exactly once and then never again, which I'd learned was as close to formal recognition as the Voss offered. Commander Van's shoulder had healed the way Voss injuries did fast, and with a scar that darkened the bronze skin around it in a jagged crescent that matched the older one along her jaw. She wore both without comment, the same way she wore everything, like scars were simply a ledger of decisions she stood behind. I'd been reclassified, same as before, permanently attached as a coalition liaison engineer with a mandate broad enough that nobody in the chain of command seemed eager to touch it twice. My days were full reactor maintenance, sled repairs, the occasional consultation on tactical drills where my habit of looking at problems from the wrong angle apparently still had value. It wasn't glamorous. It was mine. For the first time since Peterson's, or rather, since whatever administrative chain had put me on Calder's reach originally, I wasn't waiting for the other boot to drop. Then the transport ships came. 3 of them, sleek and dark-hulled, flying escort formation around a 4th vessel, 2 large and 2 ornamented to be anything but ceremonial. The compound sentry drones flagged the approach almost 20 minutes out, and by the time the first ship touched down on Pharaoh's landing pad, every Voss warrior in the compound had already assembled in formation without being ordered to. "Who is that?" I asked Rask, watching from the maintenance bay as the ceremonial ship's ramp began to lower. Rask's expression had gone tight in a way I'd never seen from her before, not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it. "Matriarch Kor," she said, "Voss High Council. She does not travel this far from the homeworld for pleasantries, Mason." That's not reassuring. It was not meant to be. Commander Van met the matriarch at the base of the ramp, and even from a distance, I could read the body language well enough to understand this wasn't a friendly visit. Van stood with her shoulders squared, chin level, a posture of respect, not submission. Matriarch Kor, older, taller even than Van, with silver threading through the deep bronze red of her skin and a formal sash marking her rank, didn't earn the gesture at all. "Commander Kessa Van Thurl," Kor said, her translated voice carrying clearly across the courtyard even from where I stood. "I have traveled 11 days to stand in this compound, because word reached the council that you have taken a Terran male into your ranks as a full warrior of the Ashguard." "I have," Van said without hesitation. "You understand this is a violation of Pack law, as it has stood since before either of our mothers were born." "I understand the law was written before the coalition existed, matriarch. Times change. Threats change. My unit adapts or my unit dies. I choose adaptation." A murmur went through the assembled Ashguard, not disagreement, but the specific kind of tension that comes from watching your commander say something true and dangerous in the same breath. Matriarch Kor's eyes swept the courtyard until they landed on me, standing awkwardly in the doorway of the maintenance bay in a grease-stained jumpsuit, several dozen very tall alien warriors between us. Her gaze held there a long moment, evaluating, the way you'd look at a specimen someone had insisted was more dangerous than it appeared. "Bring him forward," she said. "The grievance." I walked across that courtyard feeling every bit as small as I had on my very first day at Faro, except this time the eyes on me weren't hostile so much as clinical. Matriarch Kor studied me the way an inspector studies a piece of equipment somebody claims performs better than spec. "Terran," she said, "tell me your understanding of why you stand in this compound." "Corporal Mason Edo, matriarch. I was assigned here following a false charge that was later dismissed. I chose to remain because Commander Van and the unit chose to have me." "That is not how Pack law describes your presence," Kor said. "Pack law describes an outsider occupying a position that 30 generations of Voss warriors have earned through blood, trial, and lineage, none of which you possess. You did not earn a place among the Ashguard Terran. You were granted one, informally, by a commander whose authority does not extend that far." "With respect, matriarch," I said, keeping my voice level despite every instinct telling me this was a losing argument. "I dragged Commander Van out of a collapsing courtyard under Raider fire. I rerouted a depot generator into a defense grid that broke the assault that would have taken this outpost. If that doesn't count as trial by combat, I'd genuinely like to understand what does, because from where I was standing, it felt like exactly that." Something flickered across Kor's expression, not quite approval, but not dismissal either. "You speak boldly for a creature that stands at less than 3/4 my height. I've been told that's a persistent character flaw of mine." A low sound rumbled through several of the assembled Ashguard, something between a laugh and a warning growl, quickly suppressed. Kor did not look amused. "Boldness is not the same as right, Terran," she said. "The law exists because it has protected our people for 4,000 years. It exists because outsiders, human and otherwise, have historically brought exactly the kind of division that I am currently standing in the middle of. I did not travel 11 days to be charmed. I traveled 11 days because 3 separate clan matriarchs have petitioned the council, demanding to know why the Ashguard, the most decorated regiment in Voss military history, has allowed its bloodline to be diluted by a Terran male wearing our colors. Van stepped forward before I could answer. Matriarch, with respect, the decision was mine. If there is blame to assign it to me, not to him. Oh, there will be consequences for you as well, Commander, Kor said. Do not mistake my restraint for leniency. But first, I intend to resolve the matter that actually matters here. She turned back to me, and something in her posture shifted, not softer, but more deliberate. There is a provision within pack law, older even than the exclusion clause the clans are currently citing, a challenge of merit. If a disputed member of a war sisterhood can demonstrate before a council-appointed adjudicator, under conditions the adjudicator sets, that their presence provides tactical value the sisterhood could not otherwise achieve, the exclusion may be formally overturned. Permanently. No further challenge permitted from any clan ever. And if he fails? Van asked, and for the first time since I'd known her, I heard something close to worry underneath the flat command tone. Then the Terran is removed from this compound today under council escort, and Commander Van is relieved of her command for cause, Kor said. The choice belongs to you both. Accept the trial, or accept the exclusion without contest. I will hear your answer before this ship refuels. I looked at Van. She looked back at me, and I understood without either of us saying anything. That this wasn't really her decision to make alone, not anymore. I accept the trial, I said. Kor's eyes narrowed slightly, evaluating. Careful, Terran. The adjudicator I have in mind does not make trials easy. She makes them survivable at best, and only for the deserving. Then I suppose we'll find out which one I am. The adjudicator. The adjudicator's name was Thressa Van Oel, a retired Ashguard commander who Kor's honor guard addressed with a level of deference that told me everything I needed to know about her reputation before she ever said a word. She arrived on the same ceremonial transport, silent through the entire confrontation in the courtyard, and only stepped forward once Kor had finished laying out the terms. She was older than Van by at least 2 decades, her bronze skin gone the color of old rust in places, her left arm ending just below the elbow in a smooth prosthetic housing that whirred faintly when she moved. Where Kor's presence radiated authority, Thressa's radiated something colder, the specific stillness of someone who has seen enough war that theatrics no longer interest her. I have reviewed the account of the Raider engagement at this outpost, Thressa said, her translated voice flat, almost bored. It is impressive for a single engagement. It does not, on its own, satisfy me that a Terran belongs inside an Ashguard regiment on a permanent basis. One good decision under pressure is luck as often as it is skill. I intend to determine which this is. How? I asked. You will accompany a strike team on a live operation of my choosing, Thressa said. Not a drill, not a defensive engagement inside the safety of this compound's walls. An offensive operation into hostile territory where the margin for error does not exist and no one will slow down to accommodate your limitations. If you provide decisive value under those conditions, I will certify the challenge of merit before the full council, and no clan will ever raise this grievance again. If you do not, if you become a liability, if warriors die protecting you instead of completing the mission, if your presence costs this unit more than it gains, I will personally escort you off this outpost, and Commander Van's career ends with my recommendation. And the operation? Van asked. Thressa's eyes shifted to her, and something almost like grim satisfaction crossed her weathered face. You are already aware of the situation at the Kethrin Belt refinery, Commander. 3 coalition survey teams went dark there 11 days ago. Raider activity in the region has tripled in the last month. Intelligence suggests the same network responsible for the Faro raid has established a staging base inside the refinery's abandoned processing facility. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. The same Raider network. The one connected to the stolen plasma cores. The one that had nearly overrun Faro. The one whose retaliation I'd been quietly dreading for 3 months without ever saying so out loud. "You want us to hit their staging base directly," Van said. "I want to know whether your Terran is an asset or a liability when there is no home field to retreat behind," Thressa said. "The Kethrin operation will answer that question regardless of what I personally believe. Prepare your team, Commander. We depart in 6 hours." Preparation. 6 hours is not enough time to prepare for an assault on a fortified Raider staging base, but it was, apparently, all the time Thressa intended to give us, and I got the distinct impression that was deliberate. A trial that gave you time to overplan wasn't much of a trial. Van assembled a strike team of 12, Rask, Ithara, a demolition specialist named Korvala I hadn't worked closely with before, and 8 others whose names I was still catching up to file properly, 3 months in. I spent every minute of the preparation window in the armory, going over the specs of the Kethrin refinery with anyone who'd give me schematics, cross-referencing them against what little intel we had on Raider fortification patterns from the Faro assault. "They'll have converted the primary smelting floor into a barracks," I told Van, spreading a hard copy schematic across the briefing table because half our field tablets were still cycling through VOS encryption updates. "It's the only structure on site with functioning climate control. If I'm them, I'm running perimeter sensors off the refinery's old seismic monitoring grid. It's already wired for vibration detection, and repurposing it means they don't need to run new cable through a facility that's actively falling apart." "You are guessing," Korvala said, not unkindly, just flatly factual in the specific way I'd learned most VOS communicated. "I'm extrapolating from how the Faro Raiders operated. Same network, probably same doctrine. If I'm wrong, we adjust on the ground. If I'm right, it tells us exactly where their blind spots are." Rask studied the schematic a long moment, tracing one thick finger along the old smelting floor's ventilation shafts. "If the barracks estimate is correct, these shafts run directly beneath it. Old maintenance access, wide enough for a single warrior in light gear." "Wide enough for me, definitely," I said. "Which means if we need a distraction that doesn't look like a distraction, I can be inside that barrack structure before they know we're on site at all." Van's expression didn't change, but something in the set of her jaw told me she didn't love the idea even as she recognized its value. "You are not going in alone, Mason." "I'm not planning to. I need someone who can move quiet and hit hard once I've disabled whatever's watching that shaft. Doesn't need to be a big group. A big group is what gets noticed." "I will go," Ithara said, before anyone else could volunteer, and there was something in the way she said it, quick, certain, almost defensive, that made Rask's eyes flick toward her with an expression I couldn't quite read. Van considered it for a long moment. "Ithara and Mason take the maintenance shaft, disable perimeter sensors from the inside, then hold position until the main assault draws attention away from the barrack structure. Rask, Korvala, the rest of the team hits the primary staging entrance from the surface, timed to their signal. No one moves early. No one moves alone once the shooting starts." "Understood, Commander," came the reply in near unison. 12 voices that had clearly done this exact drill 100 times before, minus one very nervous human currently doing his best not to look nervous. Thressa, seated at the far end of the briefing room, said nothing throughout the entire planning session. She simply watched, arms crossed, her prosthetic hand tapping an irregular rhythm against her forearm, cataloging every decision I made like evidence in a trial that hadn't technically started yet. Into the maintenance shaft. The Kethrin Belt refinery had been abandoned for the better part of a decade, ever since a resource survey found the local ore deposits too depleted to justify continued operation. What was left was a rusting skeleton of processing towers and crumbling gantries, half swallowed by the belt's constant low-grade dust storms, the kind of place that looked, from orbit, like nothing worth fighting over. Which was exactly why it made a perfect staging base. Ithara and I dropped in under cover of a dust storm heavy enough to blind most conventional scanning, landing our stealth pod a half-kilometer from the refinery's northern edge, and covering the rest of the distance on foot, low and slow, using the storm's own interference to mask our approach. She moved like something built for exactly this, silent, economical, reading the terrain 3 steps ahead of where her boots actually landed. "You are quieter than I expected," she said quietly, as we reached the maintenance shaft's outer grate. "High praise considering the source. Do not let it inflate you. You are still slower than any of us." Duly noted. The grate had corroded enough that it came away with minimal effort, and the shaft beyond was exactly as cramped and rust-slicked as the old schematics suggested, barely wide enough for my shoulders, forcing Ithara to move in a low crouch that would have been impossible for most of her taller sisters in the unit. We moved through it in near-total darkness, guided only by the faint thermal bloom of the barrack structure above, until the shaft opened into a narrow maintenance crawlspace directly beneath the old smelting floor. Through a gap in the corroded flooring above, I could see exactly what I'd hoped and dreaded to find. Raider bunks, weapon racks, a command terminal glowing faintly in the corner, and more importantly, the seismic monitoring array I'd theorized about, repurposed and jury-rigged into a perimeter sensor grid, its control node sitting almost directly above our position. "There," I whispered, pointing. "If I can get to that node, I can loop the seismic feed it old data instead of live readings. They won't see Rask's team approaching until it's too late to matter." "How long to do it?" 3 minutes, maybe 4, if nothing goes wrong." "Something will go wrong," Ithara said, with the flat certainty of someone who had clearly been in this exact situation before. "It always does." She wasn't wrong. Something went wrong. I'd gotten the access panel on the seismic node half open, my multi-tool already threading into the internal wiring, when a Raider patrol, 2 of them human, armed with modified plasma carbines, walked directly across the gap in the flooring above us on a route that hadn't appeared in any of the patrol patterns I'd theorized from the Pharaoh data. Ithara went rigid beside me, one hand closing around my shoulder in a silent signal to freeze. We stayed motionless in the dark crawlspace, barely daring to breathe as the Trawl's boots passed directly overhead, close enough that dust sifted down through the gap and settled on my hands. They didn't stop. They didn't look down. And after a tense, silent eternity that probably lasted less than 20 seconds, their footsteps faded back into the general noise of the barracks above. "Finish it," Ithara breathed, barely audible, quickly. I got back to work, hands steadier than I felt, and looped the seismic feed exactly the way I'd planned recorded data from an hour earlier, cycling seamlessly, indistinguishable from live readings to anyone not specifically looking for the seam. It wasn't elegant. It didn't need to be. It needed to buy Rask's team a window, and it did. I keyed the signal, 3 short pulses on the tactical channel, the prearranged all clear, and settled back to wait, adrenaline still hammering through my chest hard enough that I was fairly sure Ithara could hear it in the cramped space between us. "You are shaking," she observed, not unkindly. "Yeah, turns out crawling under an armed raider staging base does that to a person." You did not stop moving, though. Fear that does not stop the work is not weakness, Mason. Rask would not admit it, but she said something similar to Korvala last week about you. What'd she say? That you are the only Terran she has met who is more useful frightened than most warriors are confident. A pause, and something that might have been amusement flickering at the edge of her translated voice. I do not entirely disagree. Before I could figure out how to respond to that, the surface above us lit up with the unmistakable percussion of a full assault beginning. Rask's team hitting the primary entrance exactly on schedule. The Raider staging base erupting into chaos that, for the next several minutes, made absolutely everything else irrelevant. The assault. We came up through the smelting floor's maintenance hatch directly into the barracks structure, just as the raiders inside were scrambling toward the sound of Rask's assault on the main entrance. Weapons only half-readied, formation non-existent. It was, in the cold calculus of tactics, the best possible moment to hit them, disorganized, facing the wrong direction, unaware that a second threat had already been sitting beneath their boots for the last 10 minutes. Ithara moved first, fast and brutal, closing the distance to the nearest raider before he'd fully registered we were there. I covered the command terminal, rifle up, dropping the two raiders attempting to reach it before they could trigger whatever alarm protocol was wired into the system. "Terminal's yours," I called to Ithara, already crouching to pull data from it. "I've got maybe 2 minutes before someone outside notices this room's gone quiet." The terminal held exactly what Thressa's intelligence had hoped to find: staging logs, supply manifests, and buried 3 folders deep, coordinates for a secondary base I recognized immediately, because the coordinates matched almost exactly the coordinates of the wreckage where the stolen Pharaoh plasma cores had originally been recovered. This wasn't just a staging base. This was the network's actual hub, the place where everything from Calder's reach to Pharaoh to the missing survey teams traced back to. "Ithara, I need 30 more seconds." The barracks door blew inward. Not from Rask's assault, from the opposite direction. A raider heavy trooper in scavenged coalition armor plating. Clearly the squad that had been on the failed perimeter patrol, now alerted and coming in hot with a mounted repeater that could shred both of us in under 2 seconds if it got a clean angle. Ithara moved before I'd even finished processing the threat, throwing herself bodily into the trooper's firing line, catching 2 rounds meant for the terminal, meant for me, square across her chest plate. She went down hard, the impact driving the air out of her in a ragged, translator-garbled gasp. I didn't think. I grabbed the fallen raider's dropped weapon, heavier than my own rifle, awkward in my hands, and put 3 rounds through the trooper's exposed neck seal before he could correct his aim for a second burst. He went down and didn't get back up. I was at Ithara's side in seconds, tearing her chest plate open enough to check the damage. The armor had held, barely cracked clean through, but the rounds hadn't penetrated. She was breathing, coughing, very clearly in pain but alive. "You are supposed to be extracting data," she wheezed. "Not standing over me like a," she coughed again, "like a nursemaid. You took 2 rounds meant for me. Forgive me for pausing to make sure that wasn't a wasted effort." "It was tactically sound," she managed. "You had the terminal, I did not." "That's not why you did it." She didn't answer that, which told me everything the silence needed to. "Extraction." I got Ithara upright, her arm over my shoulder in a mirror of the exact position I'd once dragged Commander Van across a different courtyard entirely, and we made it out through the same maintenance hatch we'd come in through, back into the crawl space, back toward the extraction point, while behind us the sounds of Rask's assault crescendoed into what would later be confirmed as a decisive, near-total collapse of the Raider staging operation. By the time we reached the surface, the dust storm had thinned enough to see the extraction shuttle's running lights cutting through the haze, and Rask's team was already converging on the same point, dragging 2 wounded but no dead. A fact that would matter more than I understood in the moment, given what Thressa had said about warriors dying to protect a liability. Commander Van met us at the shuttle ramp, her eyes going immediately to Ithara's cracked chest plate, then to me, then back to Ithara. "Report," she said, voice tight. "Terminal data extracted," I said, holding up the data core. "It's not just a staging base, Commander. It's the network's actual hub. Coordinates for a secondary facility, supply manifests, everything. This could roll up the entire operation responsible for Faro and Calder's reach both." "And the injury?" "Took 2 rounds meant for the terminal," Ithara said before I could answer for her. "Armor held. I will be functional within the day." Van's eyes lingered on her a moment longer than strictly necessary, something unreadable passing behind them, before she turned to address the assembled team. "Casualties." 2 wounded ambulatory, Rask reported. "No losses. Staging base neutralized completely. We have prisoners for interrogation and the intelligence Mason recovered." Thressa Van Oel, who had remained aboard the shuttle throughout the entire operation, stepped down the ramp as the last of the team boarded, her expression unreadable in the storm-dimmed light. "No losses," she repeated, as though testing the words for weight. "A decisive intelligence recovery. A wounded warrior protected rather than sacrificed for the mission's sake." Her eyes settled on me. "You understand what you just demonstrated, Terran." "That I got lucky." "That luck, sustained across an entire engagement, under conditions I deliberately designed to punish improvisation, is simply another word for skill that has not yet been given its proper name," Thressa said. "I have seen enough." The interrogation. The prisoners we'd taken at Kethrin, 3 raiders too slow or too wounded to retreat when Rask's assault broke their formation, were transferred to a secure holding block inside Faro's administrative wing within hours of our return. Thressa insisted on being present for the interrogation, along with Van, and to my genuine surprise, insisted I be present as well. "You identified the pattern that led us here," she said, when I asked why. "You will understand what you are hearing better than a translator alone can convey." The first 2 prisoners gave us nothing useful low-level muscle, recruited off desperate colony worlds with promises of a cut of raider spoils, who genuinely didn't know much beyond their own immediate chain of command. The third was different. Older, harder-eyed, the kind of raider who'd clearly been doing this long enough to understand exactly how much trouble he was in, and exactly how little his silence was likely to buy him. "You're wasting your time," he said when Thressa opened the questioning. "I don't know anything about a network. I know a paycheck and a rally point." "Your rally point had a command terminal with staging logs going back 14 months, I said, before Thressa could respond. "That's not the record-keeping of muscle hired off a desperate colony. That's the record-keeping of someone who expected to need an audit trail eventually. Which tells me you weren't just hired help. You were mid-management." Something flickered behind the raider's eyes, not quite fear, but recalculation, the look of a man realizing the person across the table had actually read the paperwork. "You the engineer they're talking about," he asked. The one who took down the seismic grid. Word travels fast. Word travels real fast when half our staging network just got rolled up by an all-Voss strike team with one Terran holding the door open. He studied me for a long moment. You know what the funny thing is? You're the reason this whole operation exists in the first place. Not you specifically, but your kind. Every time some coalition officer decides skimming a supply requisition is easier than earning a promotion, that's product for us. That's how this whole thing starts. Somebody's greed funneled downstream until it's raiders and dead colonists and Voss commanders bleeding out in a courtyard. You didn't stumble into a conspiracy, Corporal. You stumbled into a business model. Who's running it? Thressa said, her patience visibly thinning. Names, locations, now. The raider's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a SM. Isle, you already have the location. Your Terran pulled it off our terminal himself. Secondary facility, out past the belt. Whoever's actually running things top level, though I never met them. Nobody below a certain rank ever does. That's how it stays clean. He leaned back as far as his restraints allowed. You want the real irony. Half the officers skimming from coalition supply lines think they're too smart to ever get caught the way your friend here almost got framed for it. Turns out the dumbest ones are usually the ones running the whole show. They think a stolen signature and a closed file is the end of the story. It wasn't, I said quietly. No, he agreed. Guess it wasn't. We got 2 more names out of him before he stopped talking entirely. Mid-level facilitators, both already flagged in the Kethrin data, corroborating rather than expanding what we already had. It wasn't the breakthrough Thressa had hoped for, but it confirmed something I'd suspected since the terminal data first came up on the analysis screen. This wasn't a single corrupt officer acting alone. It was systemic, patient, and built specifically to survive the loss of any one piece. This will take more than one operation to unravel completely, Thressa said afterward, watching the guards lead the prisoner away. Kethrin was a significant blow. It was not the final one. I didn't think it would be, I said, but it's a start. It is, she agreed. Which is more, I will note, than Matriarch Kor's clans expected a single Terran engineer to provide when this began. The Council's verdict. The formal hearing took place 3 days later, back at Outpost Pharaoh, in a courtyard packed with every Ashgard warrior not currently on active duty, Matriarch Kor's honor guard standing at rigid attention along the perimeter, and Thressa Van Oel standing before the assembly with the quiet gravity of someone whose word, once given, closed arguments permanently. I have reviewed the Kethrin Belt operation in full, Thressa said, her voice carrying easily across the silent courtyard. The Terran identified a tactical vulnerability based on pattern analysis from a prior engagement. That analysis proved correct. He infiltrated a hostile structure under conditions that would challenge a trained Ashgard warrior, extracted intelligence of significant strategic value, and when the mission's success came into direct conflict with the safety of a Voss warrior beside him, he prioritized that warrior's survival without hesitation or complaint, at direct risk to the mission's own success. She paused, letting the silence stretch. This is not luck. This is not an accident of circumstance repeating itself conveniently twice. This is the demonstrated conduct of a warrior who belongs within this sisterhood's ranks, regardless of the accident of his birth species. I certify the challenge of merit. Corporal Mason Ito's place within the Ashgard is permanent, and no clan grievance regarding his presence may be raised again before this council or any other. The courtyard erupted, not into the polite applause I might have expected from a coalition ceremony, but into that same low, rolling growl of approval I'd heard once before after the Kethrin debrief. except now amplified across the entire assembled unit, loud enough that I felt it in the ground beneath my boots. Matriarch Kor's expression, throughout all of this, remained carefully neutral, though something in the set of her jaw suggested she had not expected, or perhaps had not entirely wanted, this particular outcome. "The council's adjudicator has spoken," she said finally, addressing Van directly. "The grievance is resolved. I will inform the clans that the matter is closed." She turned to me, and for the first time since her arrival, something almost like respect flickered across her weathered features. "You fought for something worth having, Terran. Few outsiders understand that our law, rigid as it seems, exists to protect exactly that same principle. Perhaps you understand it better than I expected." "I had good teachers, Matriarch," I said, glancing toward where Rask, Ithara, arms still in a sling but standing regardless, and Commander Van stood watching. Turns out that mattered more than I realized. What the data revealed. The Kethran intelligence, once fully decrypted, confirmed exactly what I'd feared during the extraction. The Raider network responsible for both the stolen Pharaoh plasma cores and the assault on the outpost traced back to a much larger operation, one with connections deep enough into coalition, supply, lines that the original court-martial investigation into me had barely scratched the surface of what was actually happening. The corrupt logistics officer who'd framed me on Calder's Reach hadn't been running an isolated scheme. He'd been one node in a network spanning at least 6 systems, funneling coalition military hardware into Raider hands in exchange for a cut of the proceeds from raids on exactly the kind of outposts those weapons were stolen from. A closed, self-sustaining loop of theft and violence that had likely gotten dozens of soldiers and colonists killed before anyone connected the pattern. Coalition intelligence moved fast once the Kethran data hit their desks, faster than I'd ever seen the bureaucracy move on my own case. Within 2 weeks, arrests had rippled through 3 separate supply commands, and the secondary facility coordinates I'd pulled from the barracks terminal led a joint coalition VOS strike force to the network's actual command structure. An operation I wasn't part of, this time, watching the reports come in second hand from the safety of Pharaoh's comms room instead. "You seem troubled," Van observed, finding me there late one evening, watching the strike force's after-action summary scroll past on the terminal. "It's strange," I admitted. 6 months ago, I was ready to burn my entire career down trying to prove I didn't steal those cores. Now the whole thing's resolved. Dozens of people involved are in custody, and I wasn't even part of the operation that actually closed it out. Does that trouble you, that you were not present for the ending?" "No," I said, after a moment's honest thought. "It's just strange to realize the thing that nearly destroyed my life was never really about me at all. I was just convenient, a name on the wrong signature line." "Most wars begin that way," Van said, settling into the seat beside me, her considerable frame making the standard coalition-issue chair look almost comically undersized. "Convenience, expediency, someone needing a name to close a file or a border to secure, or a grievance to raise before a council that has grown too comfortable with old law. What matters is not how a thing begins, Mason. It is what a person becomes in the middle of it." She paused. "You became someone worth keeping. That is not something Peterson's typo, or Kor's grievance, or a corrupt officer's theft ring can take credit for. That was earned deliberately, one decision at a time." I didn't have a good response to that, so I let the silence sit instead, comfortable in a way it hadn't been during my very first night in that barracks. 6 months and what felt like several lifetimes ago. Ithara's recovery took the better part of 2 weeks, the cracked chest plate having done more damage to the muscle beneath than the initial field assessment suggested. I found myself visiting the medical bay more often than strictly necessary, ostensibly to help calibrate the diagnostic equipment, which ran on a Voss-modified coalition chassis that genuinely did need my attention roughly once a week, but honestly, mostly just to check in. You do not need to keep visiting, she told me, on one of these visits, propped up in the medical bay's oversized recovery frame, her translator collar picking up something dry in her tone that hadn't been there during our first weeks in the unit together. I am not fragile, Mason. Never said you were. I'm here because the diagnostic rig's calibration keeps drifting and somebody has to fix it. For the fourth time this week. It's a very finicky rig. She studied me for a long moment, the specific, evaluating look Voss warriors gave when they were deciding whether to say something they'd normally leave unspoken. You did not have to stop and check the damage during the assault. Rask would have left me and completed the objective. That is doctrine. I'm not Rask. No, Ithara agreed. You are not. Another pause, longer this time. I took those rounds because the mission required the terminal secured and you were the one securing it. That is the honest accounting of it. Is that the only accounting of it? She didn't answer right away, and something in the careful way she avoided my eyes told me the honest answer was more complicated than doctrine alone. Ask me again, she said finally. Once I am no longer confined to a medical frame and unable to properly deny anything you suggest. I laughed, and something eased in her expression that told me she hadn't entirely meant it as a deflection. Not every thread from the Kethrin operation resolved as cleanly. Sergeant Rask, whose surface assault had drawn the raiders' attention with textbook precision, spent the weeks following the operation noticeably distant, present at every briefing, sharp in every drill, but carrying something unspoken that even Van seemed reluctant to address directly. I finally caught her alone in the armory, methodically stripping and cleaning a plasma cannon that, by any reasonable maintenance schedule, didn't need it. You've cleaned that same cannon 3 times this week, I said. It requires precision maintenance, she said, without looking up. Rask. She set the cannon down, finally, and something in her posture shifted, the rigid discipline cracking just slightly at the edges. I nearly ordered the extra CDON team to abandon the maintenance shaft position entirely during the assault. When the perimeter patrol nearly discovered you and Ithara, I had the authority to call it. I did not know in that moment whether the operation's success mattered more than the risk to both of you. You didn't call it, though. No, I trusted the plan. I trusted that you would adapt if something went wrong, the way you have adapted to everything since the day you walked through our blast doors uninvited. She picked the cannon back up, resuming the unnecessary maintenance. I do not enjoy discovering that my trust in a Terran engineer has become load-bearing to my own command decisions, Mason. It is an uncomfortable realization. For what it's worth, I don't think that's a weakness, Sergeant. I did not say it was, Rask said. I said it was uncomfortable. The two are not always the same thing. That, I'd come to understand, was about as close to an emotional confession as Sergeant Rask was ever going to offer, and I respected it exactly as much as it deserved. 6 weeks after the Council's verdict, Coalition High Command, perhaps eager to extract some positive publicity from an investigation that had otherwise embarrassed several senior officers, formally expanded my mandate. I was no longer simply attached to the Ashguard as an engineer of convenience. My new orders designated me as a permanent tactical integration liaison, with authority to consult on joint operations across the entire Voss Coalition alliance, and more importantly to me, personally, full protection under the same council ruling that had certified my place within the Ashguard specifically. No clan could challenge my position again. No tribunal, no reassignment order, no clerical accident could quietly undo what a formal council adjudication had settled. For the first time since a logistics officer's greed had put my name on a stolen manifest, I had something that felt less like a temporary arrangement and more like an actual, permanent place. Van marked the occasion the way the Ashguard marked most things, without ceremony, and entirely on her own terms. She found me in the maintenance bay, working through a routine sled inspection, and set a small item on the workbench beside me without preamble. A strip of dark metal, etched with Voss characters my translator rendered, roughly, as the one who held when the line demanded it break. Rask had it forged from the scavenged raider armor plating recovered at Kethrin, Van said. It seemed a more fitting material than anything ceremonial. That's twice now someone's given me something forged from enemy wreckage instead of a medal. The Ashguard does not award medals for surviving what should have killed you, Van said. We mark what a person chose to become while surviving it. There is a difference. She studied me a moment, that same appraising look from our very first meeting, except entirely without hostility now. You could still request reassignment, Mason. The Council's ruling protects your place here, but it does not compel you to remain. I know, I said, setting down my tools. I'm not going anywhere, Commander. I think we've established that by now. We have, she agreed, and something in her expression, weathered and scarred and utterly unlike anything I'd expected to find comfort in 6 months earlier, settled into something that might, in a species less inclined toward understatement, have been called warmth. Good. The unit would not know what to do with itself otherwise. Corporal Mason Ito didn't just survive the Voss Ashguard's trial by fire this time. He faced down an entire clan's grievance, exposed a raider network that had been operating undetected for over a year, and earned something even Voss law couldn't strip away from him. A permanent place among the only family that had ever chosen him without hesitation. But out here, in contested space, quiet never lasts long. Somewhere out past the Kethrin belt, the network's remaining cells are still regrouping, and the next chapter of Mason's story is already waiting. If you enjoyed this second chapter of the Ashguard story, smash that like button, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next, and let me know in the comments. What should Mason and the Ashguard face in Part 3?